One's for sorrow, two's for joy, three's for a girl and four's for a boy, five's for silver, six for gold, seven's for a secret never told.
Folk horror is terrifying because it treats older moral and cultural worlds as if they were never really gone. In the broadest sense, folk horror is usually defined as horror rooted in folklore, folk belief, and older communal practices. A more classical version of that definition, often tied to Adam Scovell's folk horror chain, emphasizes landscape, isolation, skewed moral or belief systems, and some final happening or eruption. And that structure is useful because it tells us what tends to appear in folk horror again and again, but it only gets us part of the way there. What helps more, at least for me, is the move that I'm not going to try to pronounce their names, so I'll put it right here. And they will just be known as B and C as we reference them. But the move they make in the folk horror feeling, Monstrous, Modalities, and the critical occult, their argument is that folk horror is not just a fixed subgenre or checklist, but it's also a sort of mode or feeling. And that matters because it lets us stop asking only what folk horror contains, and it lets us start asking how it works on us. The documentary Woodlands, Dark Days, and Bewitched treats folk horror as much more broader than a tiny British niche, and it shows us the forms stretch across these films. So for me, folk horror is not just horror that includes folklore. It's horror that uses folk horror to make older moral and cultural worlds feel active, coherent, and present. And what makes this so unnerving is not simply that these worlds are different. It is that they are understandable. It doesn't feel random, they feel organized, and they feel morally certain and ethically certain even on their own terms. And this is where the outsider point of view becomes so important, because in folk horror, the main character is not just a person in the story. They are the audience's bridge to the world. We identify with them immediately because they don't belong there either. And so therefore, their confusion becomes our confusion, and their effort to read the world becomes our effort to read it. And at first, this gives us sort of the illusion of difference and distance, right? Like, we are entering this world from the outside, looking in through somebody who's still anchored in a more familiar modern logic, like us as the viewer. And this is where, not going to try to pronounce their names again, but we will refer to them as E and H. And this is where their readings are really useful as well. Film theory, an introduction through the senses, centers on the relationship between cinema and spectator, and on the way that films imagine a certain relation between the screen and the viewer's mind, body, and senses. And that framework helps us explain why the outsider matters so much, specifically in folk horror. The protagonist is not just narrative information. They actually shape the viewer's position in a very active way. And I think that's the deeper power of folk horror, right? It actually uses the outsider to guide us into a world that first appears so distant and alien, but gradually reveals that world as coherent enough to be understandable. The line of our ethics and their ethics starts to blur. And it's not because these films are telling us that sacrifice is good or that cruelty is secretly an enlightened sort of thing, but it's because they present the ways of thinking about life, death, harvest, and communal continuity that feel chillingly complete. And so that is why The Wicker Man and Midsommar are such great films to put together. They come from two different moments in the genre, and they center on very different outside figures. Both of them reveal two separate ways that folk horror makes that outsider bridge fail.
You suspect foul play?
I suspect murder and conspiracy to murder.
In that case, you must go ahead.
So in The Wicker Man, the outsider position is built through certainty, right? he feels like a really stable guide for the viewer. He seems like somebody who can enter Summersile, interpret what he sees, judge it from the outside, and the film encourages us to trust him and to trust that structure because it's the plot that we're given, right? But what makes the Wicker Man so powerful is that it hides the fact that Howie is actually helpless from almost the beginning. He thinks he's uncovering the island's truth and what the island is trying to cover up, but he's really following a path this island has already set and laid out for him. And that is why I think the film does more than just reverse the plot. It reverses confidence.
You are the fool, Mr. Howie. Punch. One of the great fool victims of history.
It reverses his confidence and therefore ours. And the final reveal does not just tell us that Howie loses. It tells us that the moral ground that he thought he was standing on was actually unstable the entire time. And the film reinforces that throughout form. Summersile is not presented as some hidden underworld that only appears at the end. It's actually shot and choreographed and designed as a very bright public, musical, and embodied space that's very communal from the start. All of it makes the island feel fully lived rather than just a secret that they're sort of hiding. And that's where Linda Williams becomes so useful in film bodies, gender, genre, and excess. And she helps explain how horror broadly works, not just through ideas, but actually through physical and bodily effective force. And the Wicker Man is definitely doing that too. Even before the climax, Howie's distance is under pressure from a world that is more collective, more sensual, and more physical than the one that he represents. And so when we are sitting through all of these scenes, we're seeing these images and rituals and belief systems that aren't inherently graspable to us. We are getting a physical, bodily effect that aligns with the one that Howie gets as well, and that only draws us to identify with him as a main character more. And therefore drives the plot going into the final act and that subversion of story. And now we're going to talk about Midsommar a little bit because this works very differently, right? This is a more modernized picture, female protagonist, and even beyond the gender divide there, there's also a huge divide in character and how she is coming into this outside perspective. She arrives already shattered by grief. She's emotionally neglected, and she's disconnected from the life she's supposed to belong to. So from the start, she gives the viewer a much more vulnerable bridge into the commune, and she does not help us stand above it, she actually makes us as the audience open to it. And it's a really smart and neat thing that Ari Aster does here, where he inducts us into this commune as he does Danny. And that's what makes Midsommar so disturbing in a way that feels very different from The Wicker Man. The commune's pull on Danny feels genuine. The women cry with her, they mirror her pain, they answer it in a way Christian never can. And that means that the horror is not simply that Danny is being manipulated, it's actually that absorption into the commune feels really, really understandable. That to me is the scariest thing about both of these films, but more so Midsommar, is that it makes sense. And so the line between horror and comfort is blurred, and it's very hard to see in this picture, because the film gives us a worldview in which grief is a collective thing, right? Emotion is mirrored and individuality is less central than shared feeling. And that world is horrifying, but it's not because it's incomprehensible. In fact, it's really the other way around. It's understandable enough to us to feel dangerously close. And so again, we see here that the film does not just tell us through theme, it makes us feel through form. Like for the crying scene that you guys just watched, for instance, the scene stops feeling detached and observational. We start to feel like active participants, right? And that is where the E&H spectator-centered thinking overlaps really nicely with Williams' emphasis on bodily effect. The shift is formal, not just conceptual. The film changes how we inhabit the scene through things like the camera movements. The camera goes handheld here for the crying scene and matches the sort of movements and emotions of the scene, and this makes us feel like we are in that room, like we are crying with her. And Carol Clover also helps here, especially in her body himself, gender in the slasher film. One of the most useful things in Clover's work is her attention to unstable identification and to show how horror can recognize who the viewer aligns with. And this matters a lot because Howie and Danny are not just two outsiders, they're two very different structures of identification. Howie gives us this masculine sense of authority, certainty, and judgment. Danny, on the other end, gives us grief, need, and emotional openness. And that difference changes the viewer's relationship to the entire film. And what both films reveal about folk horror, though, is that the genre is powerful not because it gives us something completely alien, but because it gives us something that's very disturbingly understandable. And that's also why the borders of folk horror, broadly speaking, actually feel looser than they are. I mean, even a film like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre can feel folk horror adjacent, not because it perfectly fits one fixed formula, but because it creates a similar effect of rural isolation, alternative social logic, and outsider collapse. And I think, just speaking broadly about folk horror as a genre, I think that the root fear does not just come from folklore. I think it comes from these older worlds, and it asks us, what was before our way of thinking? What came before this societal set of rules and regulations that we have today? And it puts us in that place in a modern day and makes it feel alive.